Platonic metaphysics in terms of a two-world view. Here we have it in its Renaissance portrayal. And in Western culture in general, we have the notion that there's an ideal, more perfect world that has been, in this case, Christianized or Westernized through the Judeo-Christian metaphysical tradition, but which came before with Plato, right? And we have the notion of a worldly reality. We have the notion that there's requires a way to cross the dividing line. With Plato, it was through access to the rational knowledge. Through the medieval ages and in Christendom, it was through a non-rational but religious and contemplative soul, or the education of a soul through religious texts and religious iconography. For Plato, it's through education of the mind and contemplation of the good. But you still have the same notion of steps to enlightenment with a more perfect, achieving more perfect knowledge of the world. So it's a really cool thing to see there and to spot the influence of Platonic dualism in our own culture. Now, where else does it show up? Now, a couple of you have already intimated the ways in which you saw it pop up in The Matrix. It's about as easy as it gets. There's the world of shadows, the visible world, right, which is less real than the true world of forms, the code that you need to make something the thing that is what it is, right? In the invisible world, this corresponds to the world of being. This corresponds to the world of becoming. Things don't decay, things decay. This is a form, or the rational principle, and this is a constant world of flux, where flux just meaning change. Things change and decay. You also see Platonic forms in The Matrix. This is later on in The Matrix, of course, but you have the material thing, that beautiful chocolate ganache. It actually looks like a German imperial port, which are very thick and have a rich layers of thick chocolate ganache, and that looks like shaved white chocolate into little rosettes. But as delicious as that may sound, it's not the form of the thing. The form of the thing is actually the principle behind it, right? The actual program or mathematical principle that constitutes what it is. So that's in The Matrix. But you also saw it in The Truman Show. You saw Sea Haven, right? But the thing about Sea Haven is that was what Truman saw and interacted. That was the visible world. But it turns out that there was a more real invisible world that he could not see, that orchestrates and produces the effects that we experience in the material world. Think of the scene of where Christoph is trying to drown Truman in the boat, to capsize the boat. So there you have a two-world view, where you have one that's causing, or is the cause of the particular instantiations of the form. So the program that he puts in is a program for storm, for waves, higher waves, more crashing waves, dangerous waves, that Truman has to bear out in the world of Sea Haven. So you have Platonic dualism in The Truman Show. But you also have, to go to use the knowledge from last week, you have the allegory of the cave in The Truman Show. One of the places where it's just absolutely clear, and we still don't have the technological capacities. If anybody taking this course also works with Canvas, hint, hint, maybe this is something we can work towards. We don't have the technological capacities to integrate movie clips into these for institutional license purposes, all these kinds of things. So until then, what I do is I put the dialogue. So we have this representative dialogue of the shadow makers and the prisoners, right? Sylvia is the one that's saying, you don't know Truman, he's actually going to break free. She's kind of like the philosophical midwife. Like, she kind of plays Morpheus' role. She's like, she believes in him, you can do this. Because she knows the difference. She's been in both worlds. She knows both worlds, right? And she knows that Truman is being manipulated, and that it is not right. And Christoph, right, which is the shadow maker in this sense, the architect, so to speak, he's saying, look, I've given Truman a chance to live a normal life, the world, but how is the world defined here? This is the metaphysical world of chains, being in chains. And he says he devalues the world outside of being, outside of the cave. The more real world should be the world that he has produced. But She tells us very quickly he's not a performer, he's what? A prisoner. Right? And Kristoff says, well, this is kind of really cool because it's idealism, right? He can leave at any time. He was born with the knowledge, so to speak. He's capable of having these intuitions and suspicions that if he really wanted to, he would act or enact or act upon those basic intuitions. He's like, if he was absolutely determined to discover the truth, then there's no way that we could prevent them. And he says, what really distresses you is that he seems to prefer his bondage or his cell. But Sylvia, playing the part of Plato here, the idealist, he says, you're wrong. He's going to prove you wrong because he's going to get unchained because the knowledge was always already within him. The knowledge was always already within him. So that's where we end with Platonic metaphysics, and we start to make the transition, and all the examples, and we start to make the transition to Cartesian metaphysics, or the metaphysics of René Descartes. And to do that, let's look at Blessing's article in general, right? Now, the thing that's cool about Kimberly Blessing's article is she does a really nice job of providing us with a backdrop for understanding the transition from ancient Greek philosophy from ancient Greek philosophy to the modern philosophy of Descartes. When we use the word modern, we don't mean contemporary or right now. We mean relating to the historical time period that corresponds with the modern age, which is the Enlightenment from the 17th century onwards. So it's a nice transition from ancient Greek philosophy to Descartes' philosophy. And so she kind of unifies 2,000 years of metaphysical history by using this theme of skepticism. How so? Well, according to Blessing, metaphysics originated in ancient Greece. She's like, I'll give you that. It came from ancient Greece, Plato and Aristotle, and the skeptics. And it's particularly evident in the work of the skeptics. Who are they? Well, they were a group of philosophers that were the first to formalize metaphysical questions called the problem of the external world, right? And another problem that was called, that followed this, that was the response, and we called the theory of probabilism. So she says, look, the problems of the external world and the response that came to it essentially are the same ones that Descartes uses over 2,000 years later. And so they're important to look at. The first is the problem of the external world. It's a lot simpler than, it sounds really formal and everything, but it's really simple. And the problem of the external world says this: can I know, this is crucial, with certainty? It's not can you know, anybody can know. Can you know with certainty? Again, certainty is the key. Can I know with certainty that there does exist a world independent of my perceptions or ideas of the world? So I ask you, how do you know that there's a world? How do you know? Like, prove it to me. You're going to say, well, because I touch it. And you give me some, you're going to give me some billiard ball universe, causal push-pull mechanisms. You're going to say, look, I'm going to push this, and it's going to, you're going to have the same experience as I am. But that doesn't guarantee certainty. That's just probability. It's probable that's going to keep on happening because it's possible. Is it possible that the next time that you do the same thing, it won't happen? It is. You know why? Because science relies on this. Science relies on this contingency. It relies on the possibility that the next time that you perform the experiment for the billionth time, not billionth, but let's say 10th time, that every time the same thing will happen. But on the 10th time, you might get different results. So you test and retest your hypothesis again and again. The euglena in the little petri dish might just glow on the 10th try. So you can't say absolutely or with certainty that there's an external world. You can give me a really good story that's pretty good about how it is that you know that the external world is there. And you can say, look, I'm going to throw this and you're going to feel it. And my examples are so violent. I've got to come up with less masculine violent examples. But you can say something like, I'm going to poke you, I'm going to prod you, I'm going to pinch you, and you're going to feel it, and then you're going to give me some sensory account as to how I, as a part of the external world, am actually there. That's the problem of the external world. It's a problem, because we can't say with certainty that there's a world. Doesn't that blow your mind? Like, if you really think about it, This Bishop Berkeley will go on and say he'll be an idealist, a rational idealist, because he's saying, look, the only thing that we can know is our sensory experiences, but of our thoughts, of the ideas that we have. That's the extent of our world. It's a pretty good one, but nobody can prove that there exists anything outside of that. And this leads to the answer. There's like, okay, so what that we can't know for certain? We can know pretty well with probability, right? The best information we can gain is only probable. It's not certain and should be judged by probabilities or persuasiveness. The scientific method was built on this. This is all fine and good, but Descartes is going to be like, no, we need more, right? Now, these two views are going to show up in the work of René Descartes. He can certainly be seen as having the characteristic of being a skeptic, because he's going to say, how do we know? How do we know that that exists? This is going to be like mimicking a little bit of Socrates, who's always asking why? Why? How do you know that that's what it is? You've got to know the form of something. Otherwise, you don't know that that's what something is. And so what Descartes is going to do is he's going to say, I'm not okay with just knowledge without certainty. Science may be okay with that, but I want to go deeper. I want something that's more foundational. And for that, we're going to have to understand that he is a rationalist. If you have forgotten from last lecture, right? Remember that from the last lecture, we introduced the terms rationalism and idealism by comparing them to rationalism and idealism as internalist views and empiricism as externalist view, right? So we know that metaphysics originated in ancient Greece, with Plato we describe as an idealist or an internalist, but then we have the rationalists of the 16th century. Descartes is a rationalist. Now, rationalists justify their knowledge on the nature of the nature of the world through the use of logical, deductive reasoning skills. Their view was modified by a group of philosophers known as the empiricists or externalist scientists, which also used reason to justify their knowledge of the world, but instead emphasized the role of sensory experience, knowledge gained through our senses, to arrive at that knowledge. That is to say, they used logical, inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is a way of thinking through things based on that science uses, right? Skills based on first-hand knowledge, because you saw it, because you tested it, because you were there, of the observable world, like the methods of scientists, okay? Why is this important? Why is this important? Because Descartes is going to be responding to the limitation that he sees scientists as having. Scientists and empiricists are never going to be able to give us certain knowledge because they rely on observation of an observable world. Again, scientists are never going to be able to give us absolute certain knowledge because they rely on an observable world, on phenomena that can be observed. If I can't see it, if it doesn't exist in a way that I can touch it, poke it, prod it, how can I test it? You can't. And so we go to Descartes. René Descartes is considered to be the father of modern philosophy because he formalized a method for arriving at truth based on deductive principles of logical reasoning, a method that aimed at arriving at rational certainty. I'll say it 10 times. He wanted absolute certainty. He wanted the internal consistency of claims so that they were absolutely undoubtable or indubitable, right, when making any knowledge claim. Now, he was also an accomplished scientist. He was a mathematician, a really important mathematician, actually, who was deeply concerned with major shifts in how humans view the world that were happening in his own lifetime, right? He kind of grew up during the scientific revolution. And the world was so rapidly changing all around him, kind of what the war was to Plato, science was to Descartes. The world was really changing because of the rise of the scientific revolution, right? Galileo and Copernicus and Brahe and all these people were telling us, nope, this is not the way the world actually works. It's actually very different, right? Heliocentrism, the role of the sun in revolution in the universe, right? Newton, laws of gravity, all of these things. And so these new world views were really kind of at the foreground of philosophical investigations at the time. They were shaking up the world. They were what were all the foundational ideas that were changing the landscape of thought were based on science. So it was like the new revolution. And this was unsettling all previous claims. So let me say this. This was really important and disturbing to Descartes for two reasons. First of all, it was important to Descartes because he was a scientist. He loved science. He was a mathematician. He believed in reason, rational principles, and logical truths that you can defend. But he was also a man of God. He also was a believer. And so the thing that's going to come into sharp contrast for Descartes is the fact that science, I'll repeat this later, science is limited because it can only speak truths about observable phenomena, test hypotheses that can be observed. And religious phenomena cannot be observed. Certainly we can talk about our internal belief, our mental belief states. A psychologist or psychiatrist might investigate the internal states or beliefs of a person who is religious and ask prodding questions about what we believe or what our internal experiences or individual experiences of religion are. But we can't get at religious phenomena as a bare experience in themselves. They're not an observable, testable phenomena. These are two quick links to Descartes, kind of like a rundown, the quick version of Descartes. Now, to summarize what we're going to go over now in the second part of the lecture with Descartes is I'm going to make sure that by the end of the lecture you've understood what Descartes means by radical doubt, his concept of radical doubt, which is his method, right? It's also known as Cartesian skepticism, Cartesian doubt, radical doubt, all of those are synonyms. And we'll repeat this again and again. This is a slide that you can come back to when you get lost. This is just everything that's in the slides, the upcoming slides, is right here. We're also going to go over Cartesian dualism and the notion that mind and body are separate ideas, the mind-body problem, and the problem of solipsism, okay? And I summarize all those for you, nice and neat, so that you can have them. Okay, so before getting clear on why Descartes goes through radical doubt, why his philosophy is, why he describes the world as on the basis of dualism, the nature of knowledge in a dualistic way, and why that leads to certain problems, we have to understand his project. And to understand his project, we have to understand or get clear on what science considers to be the standards for truth, which are called facts in the science. We have to understand how science and rational certainty work together. Now remember, and I've said this several times already, but the concepts are much simpler than we think. For a fact to be a fact, you don't need rational absolute certainty. You don't need absolute certainty that something is true, because what guarantees the truth of a fact is the validity and soundness of the method or the processes used to arrive at the knowledge. Let me repeat that. For a fact to be a fact, you don't need rational or absolute certainty that it is true, because what guarantees the truth of a fact is the validity and soundness of the method or the process used to arrive at that knowledge. In other words, what is the thing that guarantees a fact? The fact that you followed, right? You start with a testable phenomena. You start with observation of nature. Now, nature has to be an observable phenomena to begin with, right? It can't be a religious phenomena because you can't test it. You can test an internal belief. So you can put a person who's having a religious experience or a manic experience under an MRI, and you can point to the colors on a PET scan or an MRI and say, there, the colors lighting up as blue or red, that's religion, or that correlates with religion. But you can't test the religious phenomena itself. So to begin with, separate worlds, right? You need a hypothesis, prediction, test, yada, yada. You go through the whole process, and you can either keep or reject the hypothesis and have a new hypothesis, right? So in this case, if the knowledge was produced through conducting sound scientific procedures, right? The hypothesis, empirical testing, verification of results, etc., then you can say you have a fact. But if later scientific inquiries prove the opposite or modify the original truth, then the new fact is simply incorporated, not as a lie, but it's just incorporated into the history of scientific knowledge. So let's look at a fact, right? Fact A, Pluto is a planet. All right. Poor Pluto. He's like a little dwarf planet now. He's no longer a planet, right? So we have to remember that science can only speak about things that can be investigated, objects that can be put to the test through empirical inquiry or observation, especially in a controlled setting. You can't put religious phenomena in a controlled setting, right? It can't be tested. And scientific facts or claims to knowledge can never be certain because by definition they have to be ready to be revised, to be changed, to be overturned, right? So this is how Einstein overturned Newton, and it's still science. So 20 years ago, a teacher says, give me a model of the universe and all the planets. You would include Pluto, but now no more Pluto as a planet. So Descartes was deeply, deeply troubled by this. Remembering, because he was a scientist, a mathematician, and a man of faith. He believed in God. He both admired science greatly, but he really worried that this new inductive scientific method was going to essentially, because everybody was getting on the boat, everybody was saying, remember, it was Sir Francis Bacon who introduced the method of science, or formalized, in the 17th century, who formalized the scientific method, who said the famous quote, "Knowledge is power." Everybody who was anybody was getting on the science boat, and he thought that what would be left behind was not science but faith. So he was deeply troubled and wanted to sort of set off his philosophical career by creating a method that would allow not for the claims of science, but for absolute truth or absolute certainty, the kind of certainty that would allow us to make general claims about the things that matter, the truths for Descartes, the truths of religion, for example. So that's where the meditations in first, the most important building blocks, first philosophy, come in, right? So to summarize, as we've sort of heard in this lecture so far, Descartes began his philosophical career by trying to set forth the basic principles of a new kind of, his version of a scientific method that would compete with the one that Galileo and Newton had introduced and which had been proving so successful at the time, right? He was a man of science after all. But at the same time, to summarize, he also wished to show that the new scientific methodology that he wanted to create or compete with was highly consistent with Christianity and proved no threat to it. But in order to do that, we were going to have to create a kind of a weird split between religion and science. We're going to have to create a weird kind of split between knowledge achieved through the mind and belief, and also belief based on sensory experience. Don't worry if you feel like you can't write this down. I'm just going to repeat myself for the next couple of slides. I'm just summarizing. So once again, in order to do this, Descartes knew that he would have to create a split between knowledge achieved through the mind and belief based on sensory experience. This was going to have to be two different kinds of things. So here by First Philosophy, he's going to write a book, a treatise, Meditations on First Philosophy. And by First Philosophy, he's going to mean a kind of method of investigation that comes first. If you really want to know with certainty, this is the first thing you got to do. The philosophy that's at the heart of everything. You have to follow this method to arrive at what kind of truth? Absolute truth, certainty, right? So again, to recap, once again, Descartes had two main aims in his meditations, in his book, The Meditations. Number one, to provide a more sound or a deeper basis for knowledge than the scientific method. He wanted absolute certainty, not just pretty good certainty like facts. He wanted a science of sciences that could arrive at undoubtable or indubitable absolute knowledge. And to do this, he wanted to show that the real source of scientific knowledge was going to come from the mind and not the senses. And the second goal that he had was to show that science and religion were compatible. Pretty cool, huh, in terms of history. Science and religion were in fact compatible. Now, he's going to do this very famously by splitting up the world. That's why we teach him in metaphysics. He's going to do this by splitting up the world into two different types of substances, mind and body, right? To show that science and religion are compatible, to give us a new method, he's going to split up the world into two different types of substances, mind and body. So science is going to be completely true of the body, right? And anything that we can say res extensia, Latin for extended matter. But religious truths will have to deal with the soul or the mind, and he will split the two. Now, what I've done for you is I've tried to outline in the most simple way I can all the basic arguments. The Blessing article gives you these arguments too, but she sort of puts them all over the place, and I wanted to sort of systematize them for you. Throughout the meditations, I've just summarized them. You can have three main arguments: the argument for radical doubt, the argument of existence, and the argument for that mind and body are separate substances. These three arguments are the arguments that he uses to support or to prove his thesis of those two main aims, right? To provide a more sound basis for knowledge in a scientific method, a real source that can be, where knowledge can be undoubtable and certain, and to show that science and religion are indeed compatible. How does he do this? How does he do this? By arguing A, B, and C. So let's get to that. Let's go ahead and go through A, B, and C now. Okay, let's start with the first one. The first thing he needs to do is he needs to show that his method is better than science, he's going to need to give us a method that can compete with science. Now, science gives us a pretty good method, but he's going to give us a method that he's going to call radical doubt. We call it Descartes' method or Cartesian skepticism. Okay? Now, Cartesian skepticism is Descartes' method for arriving at truth, right? Sometimes it's called methodological skepticism or radical doubt. We'll make sure why we understand why it's methodological skepticism. But suffices to say that to summarize radical doubt, at the end of the day, it's just the idea that your senses can't be trusted. If they can't be trusted, then you have to doubt them, right? It's radical doubt. So in order to show that the science rested on firm foundations, like his science, and that these foundations lay in the mind, not in the senses, Descartes is going to begin the meditations by calling everything, all beliefs that he previously held to be true, into doubt. What kind of beliefs? Beliefs that come from the senses. So knowledge, according to Descartes, from the senses can't be trusted. Why can't senses that come from, right? So knowledge gained from the senses. I see it, I believe it. I see it, I believe it. I see it, I believe it. Why can't that be trusted? Well, several reasons. Number one, it's possible I could be crazy, right? It's possible I could be dreaming. It's possible, right? Crazy, could be dreaming. It's possible there could be some evil demon that's creating this whole reality and projecting all of these. There's an external reality projecting everything that I think that I'm the one being projected in a more external reality. It's possible that all these things are happening. It's not likely, it's not very probable, but it's possible. And as long as something is possible, then you got to deal with it. Remember, you can't have a universal claim if there's one counterexample you can find. Okay? So knowledge gained from the senses can't be trusted. Now we'll break these three down into, we'll break them down more carefully in the next couple of slides. But for now, you just have to know that because knowledge is based on senses, for Descartes, they cannot be used as a foundation for producing certain absolute knowledge. We could always be wrong. So you can't say God exists because I see him. You can't say God exists because I dreamt him. You can't say God is, right? All of these things are going to be absolutely wrong. Now, according to Descartes, remember that his overall aim for saying it's possible that I could be wrong is not to actually believe that you are crazy, that you are dreaming, that there is an evil, but simply to show that it's possible. That's why it's called methodological. It's just a method. It's a step to achieving something more important. So if I say to you, is it possible that you could be dreaming instead of sitting in that chair? Descartes doesn't care that you actually are dreaming instead of sitting in that chair. It's just the role or the function that plays in the overall argument. It's in order for you to hold in abeyance the idea that what you believe is actually true and indubitable. It's to get you to start thinking, to doubt, so that you don't just take in the world of shadows that comes at you. It's the idea that, maybe there is a more real reality than the one that I experienced in the Matrix. He doesn't really mean it for real, right? He doesn't, I know it's a colloquial way of speaking. So, in other words, his aim in these arguments is not to really to prove that nothing exists or that it's impossible for us to know that if anything exists. Right, later on in the meditations, he will prove that we really can know about external objects. But he's going to show that all of our knowledge of these things, at least as they come to us through the senses, is going to be open to doubt. So if our scientific knowledge came to us through the senses, we could not even be sure that anything outside of us existed. We can only be sure of what's in our heads, right? So that's the obvious implication. Since we don't know that external objects exist, why? Well, because it could be possible that my knowledge based on senses is faulty. Then there's a problem because we don't know that external objects exist. And so this knowledge cannot then come to us through the senses, but through the mind. We're going to need new standards of knowledge. Okay, a simpler way of saying is it possible that you could be dreaming? Is it possible that you're not sitting in that chair? Is it possible? A better way to think of it, I think, is to say, would you stake your life on it, right? If it's not absolute, then Descartes doesn't care about it. Now, Descartes is going to use these three very similar arguments to open all our knowledge and doubt, right? The dream argument, the deceiving God argument, and the evil demon hypothesis, which we're going to now turn to.